Welcome everybody. My name is John McMahon. I'm the Director General of Vanier College, and I'm going to commence with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the place in which we work and study, Vanier College, is situated within the traditional unceded lands of the Ganyangahage, or Mohawk peoples, and they are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. There's also a very, very strong historical presence of the Anishinaabe peoples in what is now known as the Greater Montreal area. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, has also long been and continues to be a gathering place for many First Peoples from all directions. So today we honor and thank the traditional custodians of this land, and we strive to work for the success of future generations. So as I said, I'm John McMahon, Director General of Vanier College, and I would like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to this very special event, a discourse, racism and justice. For those of you who are not from Quebec, and I understand we may have participants from overseas, just to give you a little context of Vanier, we're one of 48 cégeps in the province of Quebec, and we're one of the largest with about 6,500 students. Those students are divided into two main streams. We have a unique system. Those two main streams, some students are in what we call pre-university, some in technology. The pre-university, if you can imagine grade 12 and 4 years university that exist in most jurisdictions, take off grade 12, take off 1 year of university, put it together into a unique pre-university system. The 3-year programs that we have, those are more like other community colleges, and they prepare students to enter directly into the workforce with a unique aspect. They also add a full year of general education, which is really designed to supplement the technical education they're getting, so that they're informed citizens exposed to a wide range of ideas. And it's an opportunity to discuss, major issues in general education. And part of symposia like the one we're doing today are an important aspect of that for all of our students. So today is such a day. We have symposia throughout the year on a wide range of important topics. And this one is timely. We all know the events, south of the border and elsewhere, and this year. And these events are not just acute events. They're not just events that occur, once periodically. They're consistent. But when they do occur, it gives us an opportunity to reflect. And I think the events of earlier this summer have forced everyone and all institutions like Vanier College to really reflect on the need to address issues like systemic racism and how systemic racism affects all of us and affects institutions. It's part of the commitment we made to both our students and staff following the tragedy of Mr. George Floyd earlier this summer, to do our part as an institution to reflect on racism and what we can do as a community to address that very, very important topic. So I'm really pleased and thankful that we have an opportunity to come together today to address this very important issue. It's all part of a commitment that we have made to address this issue. And I think with the quality of the individuals who are participating and moderating, presenting as part of this important discourse, we will move that dossier forward. And that's always our commitment at Vanier College, is to deal with the difficult issues, to address those difficult issues and play our role in terms of making the world a better place. So I'd like to take the opportunity finally to thank our moderator, Beryl Westman. It's a pleasure to see you here, Beryl. You've been a strong supporter of Vanier College and its attempt to to address these issues. It's a pleasure to see you this morning. Our organizers, Marlene Grossman, you're a champion within Vanier, not just for being the primary organizer of today's event, but other events as well, such as the Holocaust Symposium, which will commence next week. We have an outstanding group of panelists, and I'd also like to thank all of the sponsors of today's event. So I wish everyone great success today. It's an important day, and I look forward to participating in some of the sessions, particularly the one at the end of the day, the panel of Vanier students. So again, welcome, and thank you to everyone who have made this day possible. So now what I'd like to do is introduce our very first speaker, our very first presenter, Mr. Wes Hall. So Wes Hall is an established innovator, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. As executive chairman and founder of Kingsdale Advisors, he's been named one of Canada's most powerful business people. He's also the owner of QM Environmental, a leading environmental and industrial service provider, and Titan Supply, a top manufacturer and distributor of rigging and wear products serving industries in the oil, construction, and transportation sector. And Harbor Club Hotel, Curio Collection by Hilton, one of St. Lucia's premier resorts. He's the founder and chairman of the Canadian Council of Business Leaders Against Anti-Black Systemic Racism and the Black North Initiative, committed to the removal of anti-Black systemic barriers negatively affecting the lives of Black Canadians. Wes is also a director of Sick Kids Foundation and a board member of Pathways to Education and Toronto International Film Festival, or TIFF. Wes has also changed the lives of thousands of children in the Caribbean, donating both his money and time. In 2015, Wes was the recipient of the Vice Chancellor's Award, and in 2017 received an honorary doctorate, both from the University of the West Indies. So Wes, it's a pleasure to welcome you here this morning. Wes Hall.
Get up, get in the car.
I can't move.
I've been waiting the whole time. Get up, get in the car.
Mama.
Get up and get in the car right.
Now let's turn to the United States, to the city of Minneapolis. The city is still reeling from the death of an unarmed black man in police custody.
I am George Floyd. I am Ahmaud Arbery. I am Angeloku. I am too many names to count. And these are just the names of those whose lives were cut short. What about the names of those whose lives were made harder, whose success was stifled, whose value was diminished, whose hard work wasn't rewarded, who fear for their families, who know for them it's just different? The names of those who live with the pain, the burden, and the terror of anti-Black systemic racism every single day.
We live in a time where Black men and women and boys and girls can be choked and shot and beaten and lynched in broad daylight by murderous pigs.
Their time is long overdue. We can't be silent anymore.
Take your knee off our neck.
We can't delay another day. And make no mistake,
So they are frustrated.
this isn't just an American
There is
issue.
no systemic discrimination.
It's a Canadian one too. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And it's not enough to just not be racist. We need to be anti-racist. It's not enough to just stand in solidarity. We need to move in solidarity. It's not enough to just condemn. We need to transform from the inside out, as individuals, as families, as communities, as companies, as a country. Black North is a call to action. It's a movement in the making, and it starts today. We're mobilizing the corporate community to not only transform itself, but to transform the country, to move as one, to end anti-Black systemic racism once and for all. From the boardroom to the classroom and everywhere in between, there is no limit to what we can accomplish together, and the time is now. The world has put us all on notice, and we will answer the call. with courage, with commitment, with collaboration and level we haven't seen before, because this is the fight of our lives. So welcome to Black North. Let's get to work.
Thank you indeed. Let's get to work. So John, kind introduction, and I really appreciate that intro. And I guess Marlene, you have some slides there for you're going to be the magic person on the slides. So we'll talk a little bit about you saw in the video whether or not we have systemic racism in Canada. And there are a number of business and political leaders, quite frankly, who indicated that we really don't have systemic racism in Canada. So what we've decided to do through the Black North Initiative, working with our friends at Mostyn Consulting Group, is really do some analysis to see whether or not we do have an issue here in Canada, or whether or not it's just really an American issue. So the slides you'll see at the bottom, there's a footnote in terms of where we get this information. It's all available from public sources, and so we did an analysis, and we asked the questions of Black Canadians. We said, how often are people in your racial group treated unfairly because of their race or culture? And 83% of those people surveyed, of the Black Canadians surveyed, indicated that at least sometimes they've been treated unfairly. Well, they asked non-Blacks this question: do you agree that discrimination against Black people is no longer a problem in Canada? And essentially over half the people, the non-Blacks who were surveyed, indicated that we no longer have a problem here in Canada. Next slide, please, Marlene. Then the question was, so we decided to break it down into 4 categories. One, we looked at job opportunities and income support. We looked at health and community services. We looked at children and youth development. And we look at policing to see whether or not in those areas, those 4 areas, that we see systemic racism as it relates to Black people. Next slide, please. So when we think about this issue of employment, and we look at the Black unemployment rate, for example, the non-minority unemployment rate, which is whites, is 9% in this country, whereas the Black unemployment rate is 17%. It's actually 8 points higher than the white unemployment rate. Then we actually look at Black women in this country, and look at the difference between Black women is disproportionately affected, which is their number is 19% unemployment rate in this country. Next slide, please. Then we look, for example, at a student. For example, you graduate from university with the exact same degree as your white peer. You're going to get 80 cents on the dollar, which is 20% less earning power as a result of your degree. And when you get into the workforce, again, exact same university, exact same degree, go into the workforce exact same time, you're going to get 20% less. Next slide, please. But what does that 20% less translates to? It essentially translates to $12,400 less compared to your white colleagues. So your educational return on investment is actually less than your white colleagues. But overall, it really means that annually, we're taking $1.5 billion out of the Black economy as a result of this disparity in compensation paid to Black people in the workforce. Next slide, please. When we look, for example, we break it down to racial discrimination as it relates, for example, to Black sounding names. So Wes Hall is not a Black sounding name. But what they've done the analysis on is that if you have a Black sounding name and you actually put your resume in for a job, you're actually going to get 10 times, you're actually 12 times fewer callbacks that you're going to receive over somebody with a white sounding name. And this is if a white person has no criminal record, they're going to get a 31% callback. A Black person is going to 10% callback. And it actually breaks it down even further that white resumes with a criminal record they actually get 1.5 times more callbacks than a black resume with a clean record. White resume, criminal record, 1.5 times more callback than black resume without a criminal record. Next slide, please. So when we look into the promotion of companies, and one of the things that we looked at, entry level, there's equal representation across the board. Then we look at, as we move into the C-suites, for example, representation dropped by 75% as you get into the C-suite. And so we ask Black employees, do you feel, for example, that you've experienced some kind of discrimination when it comes to major decisions in the workforce, in particular promotions? And actually 49% of those individuals indicated that they receive some form of discrimination. So only 39% agree that they're treated fairly when they get into the workforce. Next slide, please. And when we look at corporate Canada, we look at the top of corporate Canada. And what do we see? Well, we see, for example, only 0.08% of those senior executive positions are actually Black Canadians. Black Canadians represents 3.5% of the population in the US, in Canada rather. And so we look at 7 of the largest energy companies, and I'm going to go back to that a little bit, have no Blacks, put a little asterisk there. 6 of the largest banks have no Blacks, put an asterisk there as well. 5 of the largest telecom providers, no Blacks, and 2 of the largest life insurers have no Blacks. So let's look at the the energy company. So Enbridge issued a release today. It was unprecedented what they've done today, because not only have they signed the Black North Pledge, pledging that they're going to make changes within their organization, but they took the unprecedented step, right? And they changed the 7 largest numbers. Their market cap is $75 billion. And they took the unprecedented step of saying today that 20% of their board members will be BIPOC by 2025. 28% of their employees will be BIPOC by 2025. They link diversity targets to their executive compensation, meaning that if you don't hit those targets, management's gonna make less money. They also increase the procurement from diverse suppliers in their supply chain. So now they're saying that our supply chain must have companies that are diverse in the supply chain. So that is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like that anywhere in the world, and they're the first to actually put that and put specific targets and goals and objectives and penalty if you don't hit those targets. CIBC, in terms of banking, CIBC changed that recently by having a Black executive on their board. But again, there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of ways to go. Next slide, please. So when you look at the top of corporate Canada, what we see is that just really one gender race represented, right? But it's not just corporate Canada. When we look, for example, at the very top of some of our storied institutions, such as the Supreme Court of Canada, one culture represented. The Bank of Canada Board, one culture represented. Officers of federal parliament, one culture represented. Heads of the armed forces, one culture represented. We have a multi-diverse and really a mosaic in this country. But when we look at the very top of companies, what we see are underrepresentation of that representation and culture that we see in the country. But let's look at some. So what you're going to see is that we're going to see underrepresentation in the places that are really good, like the top jobs and so on, C-suites and boardrooms and the top positions in the federal government and so on. Underrepresentation in those areas, and absolute overrepresentation in the areas that are really bad. And we're going to talk about some of those areas. So next slide, please. When we look, for example, at COVID-19, and this is the City of Toronto statistics. And these are stats that are published and available. And it shows that the hardest hit neighborhoods for COVID-19 in the City of Toronto are the 5 Black neighborhoods. The least hit neighborhoods in the City of Toronto are all white neighborhoods. So if I live, for example, at York University Heights, which has 19% Black people, the infection rate is 20 times that of the Beaches area that only has 2% Black. If I live in Weston that has 33% Black people, The infection rate is 14 times the infection rate of those in Rosedale, which again is a white neighborhood. Next slide, please. Then we look at health, and we saw that Black women are 3 times higher, have 3 times higher rates of diabetes, 1.7 times higher rates of hypertension, 6 times higher rates of psychosis. Again, these are Canadian numbers, and this is not, these are available and publicly available. Next slide, please. When we look at family doctors, for example, and we know that it's very difficult to get a family doctor in this province of Ontario, but these numbers represents pretty much will be representative right across the board, right across the country. 29% of Black women do not have a family doctor in this province, compared to 8% of all women across the board in the province. Next slide, please. When we look at the high schools now, and we look at the graduation rate, for example, high school graduation rate for white students in the Toronto District School Board system is actually 84%, whereas Black Canadians, it's Torontonians, it's 29%. The dropout rates is actually 2 times those of white students in Ontario. Next slide, please. And this could justify one of the reasons why we see the numbers where they are in the previous slide. If I'm a Black student in Toronto, I'm 4 times more likely than any other students to be expelled from school. It's 48% for white Canadians, for Black Canadians, Black Torontonians rather. 12% is the average, in the city of Toronto. And as one student indicated, I watched many of my friends get expelled or kicked out of school for really no reason. So there's clearly a problem in terms of how these kids are treated in the school system. Next slide, please. Then we look at policing, for example, and this question was asked of white Canadians. Can police be trusted to treat my ethnic group fairly? And again, this is the Toronto Police Department. And the reason why we have Toronto data is because of the fact that we're unable to get data on the other places across the country, because a lot of cities do not disclose information, race information, which is one of the things we're fighting for, because their argument is that it's discriminatory to release the information. But unfortunately, because they don't release the information, you don't get the facts. So this information here is not available to you. But in Toronto, it's available. 74% of whites indicated that they can trust the police, whereas 26% of the Blacks indicate that they can, which is a 48% differential points between the two. Then they asked the question, are Toronto City police officers honest? 72% of white Canadians say yes, 41% of white Black Torontonians say yes, which is 31% indicated otherwise. Next slide, please. But when we look at also the interactions between Black people in the city of Toronto with the police, 32% of the cases involving police firearms are against Black people. 36% of cases involving police use of pepper spray against Black people. 37% of cases involving police strikes against Black people. 41% of cases involving police grounding or other force against Black people. 46% of cases involving police taser use against Black people, and 57% of cases involving a police dog against Black people. Black people represents 9% of the population in the city of Toronto, but a disproportionate amount of the negative interaction with the police. Next slide, please. Well, when we look at the federal system, and this is the federal incarceration, the federal prison population, and Indigenous people represents only 5% of the population in Canada, but yet they represent 30.4% of the prisoners, the federal prisoners in the system. 30%. There is a problem with that number. Since 2001 to 2020, that number went from 17% to 30%. And in that period of time, the incarceration rate for Black people went up 80% in that period of time. So what accounts for these numbers? Well, when you get into the federal prison system, there's a meeting that you have with an official, and they give you a score, and that score determines where you land, whether or not you get parole early, whether or not you get programs and so on. And the higher the score, the less likelihood that you're going to get paroled or you're going to get services that you need. Well, Blacks and Indigenous get the maximum score in that initial meeting, which means that they don't get the help they need in the system and they don't get the parole, so they stay in the system longer. And so as I ask Canadians, when was the last time you walked down the street and you were afraid to be mugged by an Indigenous person? When was the last time your car was stolen by an Indigenous person? When was the last time you heard of a major shooting or a whatever that may be, or a major crime, and it involved Indigenous people? Yet they represent 30% of the prison population, federal prison population in Canada. There is a systemic problem with that. Next slide, please. How about Blacks with police? They represent 9% of the population in the city of Toronto. 70% of civilian deaths involving police shooting are Black Canadians. I'm 20 times more likely to be shot dead by the police in the city of Toronto than my white neighbor. As a result, there is a systemic problem. Next slide, please. So what does all this mean at the end of the day? It means that as companies, we need to do something, just like we saw what Enbridge did. Companies need to take responsibility as well, and that's the reason why we have the Black North Initiative. There's studies after studies that indicate not only that diversity is a good thing, but diversity actually makes money. I don't know how many of you guys are on this phone are basketball fans, but if you're a basketball fan, you'll realize that Dwayne Casey, who was the coach of the Raptors, got fired. Why was he fired? He was fired and Nick Nurse took over. He was fired because he refused to play his bench. And anyone who's a basketball fan would yell at the television saying, substitute the starters and put the bench players in because the starters are losing the game. They put Nick Nurse in. Nick Nurse started to use the starters, and the Raptors were known as the best team in the NBA, and they won the championship. And they were known to be good because they optimize their bench. They use their bench. So what are we doing here in corporate Canada? We actually are refusing to use our bench. 5% of the population Indigenous, we're refusing to get them in the game to participate. 3.5% of the population Black, we're refusing to get them in the game to play the game. So once we start to optimize our workforce, optimize our population, that's where we start to see the 36% outperformance among the peer group. And that's where we also see, for example, companies start to be better, performing better. Next slide, please. But one of the things that I'm going to close with is a statement that the Globe and Mail made. The Globe and Mail said on the September 7th article that they put out, and they closed this way: systemic racism is a serious business problem that requires a serious business solution. Canadian companies that fail to act will learn the hard way that racism hurts us all. So really what we're trying to do here as part of the Black North Initiative is this. When you as a young person, of Indigenous person or Black person, graduate, work so hard in school, and you graduate university, you should be able to get a job. And once you get that job, you should be able to get promoted based on the hard work that you do and the merits that you earn. And when you get promoted to middle management, you should be promoted to senior management based on the hard work that you do. And when you keep going, you should go all the way to the very top of these institutions in Canada because of the hard work that you put in to do that. Right now, you can work as hard as you possibly can in school, work as hard as you possibly can when you get into the workforce, but you still don't get the same opportunity as others. And the whole objective is that we're going to have a level playing field so that everyone have an opportunity to participate, to win, and to be rewarded for the hard work that they do. Thank you for the time and the attention.
Hi, everybody. So I am Marlene Grossman. I am a psychology teacher here at Vanier College, and I'm also one of the principal organizers of today. I would like to introduce you to our moderator. Our Beryl Wiseman is the editor-in-chief of the Suburban Newspaper Group and the founder of the president of the Institute for the Public Affairs of Montreal, a national advocacy organization. Beryl holds 2 law degrees from McGill University and has spent over 30 years combining the worlds of politics, community activism, and media. His involvement in politics includes service as former Minister of Justice Irwin Cotler's executive assistant when he was first elected as an MP. He has won many Quebec, Canadian, and North American honors for his work, including the Lindsay Chrysler Award for Outstanding Achievement in Journalism and the Charles Hawkins Memorial Trophy for the Best National Editorial Writing. Beryl is a recipient of the Martin Luther King Jr. Legacy Award for the promotion of human dignity, the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for community service, the Order of Merit for the Republican of the Philippines, and 2 Canadian Parliamentary Certificates of Recognition for contributions to the Canadian democracy. Beryl.
Thank you, Marlene. Good morning, everybody. Wes, great presentation, great meeting you. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, and then we're going to have a combined Q&A period for you both. Michael Mostyn, first of all, is a good friend, but more importantly is one of Canada's most effective and eloquent spokespeople for civil and human rights for every community. As CEO of B'nai B'rith Canada, he oversees the breadth of B'nai B'rith's programming and advocacy initiatives, including the League for Human Rights, and has made new partnerships with all cultural communities, ethnic communities, racial communities, and stakeholders at the table. He serves as the senior spokesperson for the community at large in Canada and regularly speaks out on behalf of that community and others on those human rights issues under threat globally, not just here. And we heard some of those universal concerns in Wes's presentation. Michael is a barrister and solicitor, which in Quebec means he's a lawyer in good standing with the Law Society of Upper Canada. Very important new initiative. B'nai B'rith and the Black Chamber of Commerce recently signed a memorandum of understanding to join forces and fight together on issues of race and anti-Semitism. Michael, the floor is yours. Thanks for being here.
Great. Okay, you can hear me okay, I guess.
Yes.
Great. So, and I'm going to be sharing my screen in just a little bit when I start my slides on my computer, I guess. So first of all, thank you so much, Beryl. It's great to see you. Always great to work with you. Thank you to Vanier College for putting on such an excellent program today. And that was just a fascinating presentation, Wes. So now, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today on this very important subject. I am honored to speak to all of you. You are the next generation who before long will be in leadership roles, if some of you are not already there or on your way. No matter what path your future takes you on, you'll always be learning and studying history, and that is an essential part of the process. Speaking of history, I do have the privilege to head one of Canada's premier human rights organizations, B'nai B'rith Canada, which was founded all the way back in 1875. B'nai B'rith is dedicated to speaking out on human rights issues broadly, and specifically about anti-Jewish hatred, which is known as anti-Semitism. Our League for Human Rights produces an annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents in Canada, a document that is used by government officials, police, and others as the main source for information and data on this topic. Canada has been a wonderful place for its Jewish citizens, especially compared with the span of 4,000 years of worldwide Jewish history filled with hatred, oppression, violence, and even genocide. Nevertheless, it cannot be ignored that there are still some individuals and groups promoting hatred and intolerance against Jews in this country. Jews make up just 1% of the population in Canada, yet are the targets of almost 20% of hate crimes. That is the highest percentage out of any ethnic group in our country right now. This unfortunate fact and the bitter history that is still fresh in our community's memory is what makes B'nai B'rith sensitive to the concerns of minorities facing hatred, discrimination, and injustice around the world. That is why we speak out and take action on many important human rights issues of our time. We fight injustices against Indigenous peoples here, religious minorities such as Yazidis in the Middle East, and Uyghur Muslims in China, and of course, about widespread racial injustice against Black communities and individuals right here in North America. Recently, B'nai B'rith Canada and the Canadian Black Chamber of Commerce a major representative organization of Black Canadians, formed an alliance, signing a Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU. We're committed to pursuing common goals for enhanced economic and educational opportunities for both our communities. I'll return to this important development later in my talk. This alliance is a natural outgrowth of a shared background of historical injustice and exclusion, but also of a determination to find a pathway to overcome that injustice and make positive contributions to our broader society. As I prepared for this talk, I went back to a history that I thought I knew pretty well, yet in reviewing the details of the Jewish-Black Alliance during this past century, I learned new facts which moved me, as I hope they'll move and inspire you today. In the 1950s and 1960s in the United States, as the historic civil rights movement was taking place, Blacks and Jews joined together, marched together, and in some cases put their lives on the line together to achieve civil rights, especially voting rights for Blacks. At the time, they were still suffering under the bitter discrimination of Jim Crow rules. These rules mandated separate schools, separate housing, even separate washrooms and drinking fountains for Blacks and whites, to say nothing of voting rights being denied, often violently. It was in this terrible climate that a disproportionately large number of Jews joined the Black struggle for equal rights by peacefully protesting and helping fight battles in the courts. While constituting less than 3% of the US population, Jews made up approximately half of the civil rights lawyers in the South during the 1960s and roughly half the non-Black activists overall. Many Canadian Jews joined the struggle as well, including rabbis. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. acknowledged the Jewish contribution and sacrifice in pursuit of this cause. In his address on May 14, 1958, to the National Biennial Convention of the American Jewish Congress, Dr. King said, "My people were brought to America in chains. Your people were driven here to escape the chains fashioned for them in Europe." Dr. King added words that remain eternal. The denial of human rights anywhere is a threat to the affirmation of human rights everywhere. One of the most important and memorable alliances in this struggle was forged in the remarkable friendship between a Christian pastor, Dr. King, and a rabbi, Abraham Joshua Heschel. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, is that screen on? I hope so. Rabbi Heschel's daughter, Susanna Heschel, a professor of Jewish studies at Dartmouth College, wrote in 2012 about the bonds between these two men, describing it as one of the most remarkable friendships in Jewish history. She explained, when they met in 1963, they felt an instant bond. Despite the enormous differences in their backgrounds, Dr. King was a Baptist minister from the segregated South, trained in Protestant theology at Boston University. My father was a Jewish theologian, trained as a scholar in Germany, raised in an intensely religious surrounding in Warsaw, Poland. What brought them together was a piety that transcended differences, forged by their love of the Bible, especially the prophets. Their friendship was stoked by mutual concerns and tremendous public courage. My father spoke passionately against racism, and he engaged African-American theologians and social thinkers in dialogue, listening to their experiences. He worked together not only with Dr. King, but also with Jesse Jackson, Albert Klieg, Andrew Young, and others. Dr. King, through his friendship with my father, spoke out vociferously on behalf of Soviet Jews and in support of the state of Israel. I interrupt Susanna's account to cite Dr. King's moving words in defense of Jews, who in the former anti-Semitic, communist-governed Soviet Union were struggling to be free from oppression, free to practice their faith, free to express their culture openly, and free to leave the country if they wished to. Many Jewish activists languished in prison for years merely because they wished to be free as Jews. Dr. King understood this, and on December 11, 1966 said, "We cannot sit complacently by the wayside while our Jewish brothers in the Soviet Union face the possible extinction of their cultural and spiritual life. Those that sit at rest while others take pains are tender turtles and buy their quiet with disgrace. The struggle for freedom, as we know, does not happen overnight. It often takes time, often a great deal of time, but the effort must be made with alliances of those like Dr. King. It was not until the late 1980s and early 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed and Jewish emigration from there finally became a reality. Speaking of the Jewish-Black alliance, we need to recall the momentous days in 1965, culminating in what is known as Bloody Sunday, when voting rights marchers, including Jews, together with their Black friends and colleagues, were beaten at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, as they sought to march onto the town of Montgomery. As you look at this photograph, listen to Susanna Heschel as she describes its significance, words which resonate to this day. For many Jews, the photograph of my father in Selma with Martin Luther King Jr. at the start of the Voting Rights March in 1965 is an iconic picture. Jews are inspired by the image and also feel affirmed. It is indeed our Hebrew prophets who made justice central to God's message. Andrew Young, an early leader in the civil rights movement and a close confidant to Dr. King, once told me that many civil rights workers carried copies of my father's book on the prophets in their pockets as they marched. That's the end of the quote. The last time Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King were together was when Dr. King spoke to a rabbinical assembly convention at the Concord Hotel in the Catskills, New York, on March 25, 1968, at a gathering of rabbis honoring Susanna's father. The occasion was especially moving as she recounts it. As Dr. King entered the hall, the rabbis stood up, linked arms, and sang, "We shall overcome" in Hebrew, as a tribute to him. In introducing Dr. King to the rabbis, my father asked, "Where in America today do we hear a voice like the voice of the prophets of Israel? Martin Luther King Jr. is a sign that God has not forsaken the United States of America," end quote. 10 days later, instead of being able to join the Heschel family for the Passover Seder as planned, Dr. King was shot to death on the balcony of his Memphis hotel room. Speaking of putting one's life on the line, it was just around 1 year before the Selma March that on June 21st, 1964, an African-American, James Chaney, and two Jewish Americans, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, disappeared after working to register Black voters in Mississippi. The FBI posted a missing sign. After a 44-day search that received national and international attention, including in Canada, their bodies were finally discovered, buried near a remote country road. They had been shot to death by a white supremacist Ku Klux Klan mob. It was only decades later, in 2005, that KKK leader Edgar Ray Killen was convicted for manslaughter. No one else has ever been charged. Let's though return to something more positive, something which has a direct Martin Luther King Jr. Canadian connection, even though it's not generally known. On March 15, 1962, Dr. King spoke here in Canada at Holy Blossom Temple in Toronto as part of the Brotherhood Forum series. Rabbi Gunther Plaut, and he's seen here on your right in this photo, recorded some of Dr. King's words as follows. "Segregation must go, not because this struggle is important in our struggle with communism, but because it is morally wrong, because it substitutes an I-it relationship amongst people for an I-thou relationship. Time takes no sides. It is neutral and can be used either way, but time is always ripe for doing right. The long arc of history bends towards justice," end quote. Dr. King's reference to the I-it, I-thou relationships comes directly from his study of a very influential 20th century Jewish philosopher some of you will likely come across in your future studies, Martin Buber. Buber had a considerable impact on Dr. King's outlook on the nature of human relations in general. We should note that Martin Luther King Jr. held a doctorate in systematic theology from Boston University, studies that, given King's intellectual curiosity, led to philosophy, including Jewish thinkers, in addition to strictly Christian theology. Born in Austria, Buber escaped the Nazis, immigrating in 1937 to what 11 years later would become the State of Israel. He became a faculty member of the Hebrew University. Only a couple years later, previously unknown Israeli archives revealed that Dr. King, who in his famous 1963 letter from Birmingham jail, had drawn upon Buber's I and thou principle in the repudiation of segregation, recruited Buber in 1957 in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. Buber joined other prominent individuals around the world in signing a declaration of conscience and supporting a day of protest against the South African government. According to Holy Blossom's archives, members of Black Canadian groups attended Dr. King's 1962 talk and, quoting from the archives, "The fight to end informal segregation in Canada continued with some victories, including the closing of the last segregated school in Ontario in 1965. Yes, hard perhaps to believe, up until the mid-1960s, there was segregation in schools in parts of Canada. For Jews, it was not until the mid-1970s that quotas in various departments of universities, like medicine, dentistry, and law, both for students and faculty, were finally abolished. Canada never had a similar history of slavery like its southern neighbor, and in fact, it was often a safe haven through what was known as the Underground Railroad for Blacks escaping from slavery. However, history here is not without its own defects, which took decades to begin correcting, and which are still in the process of correcting for Blacks, Jews, and other minorities. Canada has not always been a safe haven for everybody. Jewish Canadians will never forget that as the greatest calamity in Jewish history was unfolding, the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews in Europe, including 1.5 million children, Canada closed its doors to those fleeing Europe and trying to gain entry here. Infamously, Canada denied entry to the MS St. Louis, a ship filled with refugees fleeing for their lives. This country forced that ship to turn around and send its passengers to their deaths rather than let them enter Canada. The attitude here in the 1930s and 1940s is best summarized by the brutally cold and insensitive statement that a government official made about how many Jewish refugees should be allowed into Canada. None is too many. Unfortunately, because of the depth of anti-Semitism in that period, Canada had the worst record of any Western country in helping Jewish refugees. In a 2013 article, historian Irving Abella reflected on the major changes in Canada that have taken place since that time. Canada, of the first half of the 20th century, was a benighted, closed, xenophobic society in which minorities were barred from almost every sector of Canadian life. It was a Canada with immigration policies that were racist and exclusionary, a country blanketed by an oppressive anti-Semitism in which Jews were the pariahs of Canadian society, demeaned, despised, and discriminated against. Worst of all, this had permeated the upper levels of the Canadian government, the decisions of which closed the country's doors to the desperate Jews of Europe. Today's Canada is far different: generous, open, decent, humane. Multiculturalism is now an integral part of Canadian policy, and diversity is encouraged. Yet, at a moment when intolerance seems to be the global growth industry of the new century, the lessons of none is too many should not be ignored. Immigration and refugee policies still divide Canadians. There remain significant pockets of discrimination and racism, end quote. It is vigilance in the face of discrimination and racism, and concerted action against both, that united Jews and Blacks. We find this commitment in yet another fascinating anecdote involving Dr. King's Canadian connection with Holy Blossom. When Dr. King was arrested in 1963 in Alabama, the Social Action Committee of Holy Blossom, under Milton Cadsby, the person on your left, led a movement in Canada for civil rights. It raised money both for Dr. King and also to help fight segregation in Canada. There was a large benefit event which included, among a long list of all Canadian performers, Harry Belafonte and the Canadian folk group The Travelers. This event was the first time We Shall Overcome was sung in Canada as a civil rights anthem. Following the event, Holy Blossom was broken into and the proceeds from the event were stolen. Dr. King wrote to Cadsby, "I am very sorry that you had a misfortune at the Holy Blossom Temple. It is good to know that the break-in will not in any way defeat the continuance of your efforts. I cannot express in words the deep inspiration that comes to all of us. When we gain this kind of creative backing, it gives us renewed courage and vigor to carry on. You have demonstrated in words and deeds that you are real friends to the cause of justice and freedom." End quote. On this moving subject of Jews helping Blacks and Blacks helping Jews, there's one more little-known Canadian story that must be told here. In 1942, at the height of World War II, as part of what was called the Commonwealth Air Training Scheme, B'nai B'rith's Toronto Lodge was asked to sponsor a B'nai B'rith Air Cadet Squadron. This involved recruiting, training, and equipping potential officer personnel of pre-enlistment age. Before accepting the invitation, the Lodge demanded the revision of certain regulations which had the effect of discriminating against Blacks and those born of foreign parents. That demand changed history. The strength of the squadron was restricted to 200 top-notch young men. While non-denominational in character, 70% of the recruits were Jewish. A number of Black young men also participated, and one of them rose to become the senior non-commissioned officer. Regular training was given at 2 major high schools in Toronto. This was supplemented by periods at RCAF camps and training centers. As a result of the training received in their Air Cadet days and during the war, many of these young men continued in flying careers when hostilities ended. No doubt, many of these pilots made important contributions to the Canadian war effort against the Nazis. Life and history are complicated. I cannot allow it to go unmentioned that the heyday of the Black-Jewish Alliance was followed in the 70s and 80s by considerable periods of growing alienation and even distrust. In 1966, a radical movement called the Black Panther Party emerged. I mention this because of what appears to be a previously unknown connection to Montreal, revealed by a Canadian writer, Michael Posner, who just published a biography of songwriter, poet icon, and Montreal native, Leonard Cohen. Very briefly, the story is this. One of the early leaders of the Black Panthers was Eldridge Cleaver. Following the assassination of Dr. King in 1968, and in the midst of some rioting that ensued in the US, Cleaver and others got into a confrontation with Oakland police, and 2 officers were wounded. Cleaver was arrested, but jumped bail. While on the lam from the FBI, a small number of Jews smuggled him into Montreal and hid him in a safe house owned by Montreal couple Henry and Carol Zemmel. Upon meeting them, Eldridge Cleaver turned to Henry saying, "What are you, man, Italian?" Henry answered, "No, man, I'm Jewish." According to Carol Zemmel, it was important to Henry to tell Cleaver that it was Jews who had smuggled him out of the United States. It was in the Zemmel's safe house that Leonard Cohen, who was reluctantly political, met Cleaver. Cleaver would eventually make his way to Cuba and then to Algeria. Later in his life, he had a transformation, becoming a born-again Christian, supporting the police, and even running as a conservative Republican for a Senate seat in 1986. Sadly, there were also some very negative offshoot movements. For example, Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam, which to this day indulges in anti-Semitism. He has called Jews satanic, bloodsuckers, and compared them to termites, to just name a few despicable terms. Farrakhan's anti-Semitism is revolting, but his movement, though quite visible, is unrepresentative of the overwhelming African American and Black Canadian communities. You are young, but please know, as you look ahead, that life often has many unexpected twisting roads. As I said, this was a complicated period and too much needs to be described that cannot be addressed in this brief talk. The important point to make is that Jewish-Black alliances never ended, even in what we might call strained periods. And it is both fair and accurate to say that over the last number of years, we're seeing major progress in bridge building between these two communities. The future promises more of these alliances. In early June, in the aftermath of the horrific killing of George Floyd, B'nai B'rith Canada's Special Advisory Council to the League for Human Rights expressed its solidarity with those mourning George Floyd, and also with the fight against anti-Black racism in the United States, Canada, and around the world. This council, chaired by Aubrey Zeidenberg, is a group of 25 representatives from the diverse communities that reflect the new face of Canada. The group has worked together for more than 18 years. Back in 2007, following the shocking killing of 15-year-old Jordan Manners, a Black youth in his high school, the first student to be shot to death in a Toronto school. Given our experiences in fighting hate crimes, leaders in the Black community, already members of our Special Advisory Council, reached out to B'nai B'rith about offering support, resources, and assistance in any way possible. Special advisory representatives included Courtney Betty, the attorney who represented Manners' family, Howard Scherer, the son of the former Jamaican Prime Minister, 3 times Golden Glove boxing champion Spider Jones, and others. Working together, Jewish, Black, and other diverse communities created and implemented a plan to pressure a reluctant provincial government to investigate and produce a report on youth violence. This is a perfect example of how our communities have worked together to successfully achieve positive results and help those in need, in this case, to help keep our schools safe. Returning to the tragedy of the George Floyd case, a statement from the council called for our communities to stand united in the goal of expunging all signs of bigotry, racial intolerance, and inequality from our great and vast land. Together, we will all get through this, and the brighter day we have long dreamed about might soon come. Let me end on a wholly positive and promising note. Near the outset of this talk, I referred to a recent agreement that the Canadian Black Chamber of Commerce signed with B'nai B'rith Canada. It establishes a collaborative effort to use our respective resources to share strategy and best practices in common cause against the forces of racism and anti-Semitism in Canada. We will also seek to increase positive relationships between our diverse communities and create an aspirational motivation to continually improve the economic circumstances of marginalized and diverse communities in Canada. Andrea Barrett, the leader of the Black Chamber of Commerce, who is working hard to promote Black entrepreneurship across Canada, called the agreement a game changer for both of our communities, a development that will make a big difference for years to come. During the signing ceremony, which was streamed live on YouTube, I said that with this historic event, we are advancing the close, decades-old partnership between the Black and Jewish communities in this country. Our goal in taking on this new project was a simple yet very important one, and that's what I want you all to come away with today. We want to remind the world that although both our communities are going through rough times right now, and although things are not quite where we want them to be, history proves that when we all work together for the common good, positive and meaningful results are possible. It is easy to feel confusion, anger, or even despair when reading some of the headlines that we have all read this year. But by choosing to look for positive and constructive responses, by asking ourselves what we as individuals and communities can do to help, by making the most of the opportunities we have that our previous generations only dreamed of, we can all make a real difference. If we remember and are inspired by the actions of Dr. King and others like him, we can empower ourselves to help create the better world that he and so many of our parents and grandparents dreamed of. That is the vision that inspires both of our communities. And hopefully, this step will be the first of many, with the help of students and young people like you, that will create an amazing future for generations to come for all of us. So, thank you very much.
Michael, thank you very much. Wes, just trying to find you on the screen. Wes, open your audio, and there you go. Perfect. Je voudrais souligner une chose. We're getting into the Q&A right now, and there's almost 100 attendees. It's terrific, and there'll be people be coming in and out through the day. We know that, you know, Vanier is an English institution, mais s'il y a des gens qui est plus confortable d'écrire une question en français, pas problème. I can do a translation. Just write it in whatever, dans n'importe quelle langue vous êtes confortable. Let me get the ball rolling with the questions. But first of all, with a thank you to Wes and to Michael for inconvenient truths we need to hear. Now I'm about to pose an inconvenient question. The numbers are important because sometimes people don't get it unless they see it. But I want to pose this question with a little background. So as someone who finished McGill Law School, I want to relate something to what Michael said. Till the early 80s, when I was there, Jewish students, it was known, it wasn't written, had to score 10% higher to get in. Curiously, or interestingly enough, the Université de Montréal, which started as a Jesuit school, never had quotas in any department for Jews or Blacks or anybody else, at least not written ones. Now, in terms of where we go, I recently said to a National Assembly committee in Quebec that we may not have a problem so much with systemic racism, and as an editor, I think words matter, but a societal racism. In other words, there's only so much we can go with law. And here's my question to both of you. Wes, given what, you know, we're all living through, particularly the Black community lives through. Michael, what historically we've all lived through, particularly in Black Jewish alliances. When I worked with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference twice, the last time after Hurricane Katrina, in Louisiana, in Mississippi, I mean, you saw the racism there. But I remember something that Reverend Charles Steele Jr., who's still currently the president of the SCLC, Dr. King's organization, and he said this to me when my institute did a conference in Darfur in Montreal. He said, we fought the fight in order to grow the biggest alliance, in order not to get a reactionary response from people. The fight must be for equality of opportunity, equality of treatment under the law, and sanctions for racism. But the fight is now morphing, he said, dangerously into equality of result. And equality of result is something that has torn apart traditional alliances. I open the question to both of you. Are we moving away from the traditional equality of opportunity, backed by laws, equality under the law, backed by sanctions when police commit their brutalities, to equality of result, which for anybody is almost unenforceable, leads to certain measures or initiatives that are opposed by many who have been in the forefront of civil rights struggles, who have been in the forefront of struggles for against anti-Semitism. Is that a problem that we have to face as well? And the floor is open to both of you, either of you.
Well, what I always say is that Black people, the fight today is not for equality. The fight is for fairness. Because if you're fighting for equality, the people who got all the advantages all the years are up here. You know, either have to take away the opportunities from them and give it to others, or you have to withhold the opportunities that they've been given in the past and give it to these people so they can move up. What we're fighting for is fairness. We're fighting for fairness so that we can actually work our way up to get that equality and level that playing field that we're dealing with. So I think there's a confusion to say that you know, we're here to take, for example, when we hear people say, well, you want to come in the boardroom and you want to come in the C-suite, that means you want to take my job. No, we don't really want to take your job. We want to get a fair opportunity to get access to that. We want, when our business people go into a bank to get a loan, that they're assessed fairly to get that opportunity to create that business, to create wealth for themselves and for their community.
Michael, before you respond, I want to ratchet the question or fine tune the question. So again, I go back. When I work with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, leaders like Reverend Dr. Steele Jr., their concern was the following on just your point. When we march, and we marched, and we faced the racist cops, and even in the streets of New Orleans and Baton Rouge, you felt it. We could use words like fairness and equality. Dr. Steele and other leaders, their concern was how we can translate opportunity, equality under the law. We can translate into law. How do we translate this intangible, as you put it so well, fairness, decency? There was a wonderful movie where Louis Gossett Jr. was playing a judge, and he's speaking to his own community, and he's saying, stop the riots, stop the violence, just be decent. You remember decency, it's what your grandmother taught you, except that people are forgetting decency. How can we really legislate decency and fairness? Or do we have to have laws that help to achieve quantifiable markers? And then at some point, say to our communities, whether Black or Jewish, and they've always been tied. One thing Michael left out of his presentation, and he normally finishes my thoughts, but just one fact, the only peoples in Western liberal societies that by law have been chattel, we're not talking about the Eastern Europe or have been Blacks and Jews in Western liberal democracies, France and England and Canada and America. We were second-class citizens and in some cases chattel. Do we not have a responsibility within all our communities to say, we can go this far, we can give you the protections of law, we fought for that, politicians need our votes, politicians need our money, but how do you change human nature? Is human nature, in other words, Wes, not changed because of the laws that set up quantifiable and achievable markers?
Well, it's kind of like you have tax laws, right? And the tax law says you should do this and that, but all of a sudden people find loopholes in the law. Michael talked about the Jim Crow law. Slavery was abolished, but then the Jim Crow law came into effect that essentially gave you the same results as slavery. Why? Because the people that were prohibited from doing these things, they really didn't have a principled view of what they were prohibited from doing. They still wanted the old days. So when we look at the Black North Initiative, for example, what we have companies do to sign a pledge. And the pledge is a principle-based document to say, as a company, these are the things that we're going to do on principle as the CEO of a business. So, for example, I mentioned about Enbridge and the changes that they've made. Well, there's no law right now that indicated that they have to do those things, right? But yet, because of what's going on around them, they go, we need to change the conversation and we need to apply principle to our own company, to our own executive, to the way that we do business in order for us to change things. And the reason why we're using the business people to do that is because of the fact that politicians who have made the law, they tried to enforce the law, but the principle wasn't there, right? If a police officer is driving down the street, there's a law that says you can't target me because I'm Black. But that happens. But if there's no principle behind that, he's going to stop me every single time. So
Michael, I see you're making, sorry, Wes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I see Michael making notes. So Michael, have in on this issue.
Oh, well, that's just the lawyer in me. I'm always taking notes.
It's perfect.
Especially if you're talking, Beryl.
I don't know what you mean.
But yeah, listen, it's a really, really interesting question. And I definitely, appreciate Wes's perspective on all of this. I mean, my own is that the law is neutral. Government is neutral. Our systems of justice, corporations are all neutral. At the end of the day, it's who's in control of those systems. And to your point, Beryl, it is really hard when you try to conceptualize, can we legislate morality as opposed to equity under the law, justice under the law, to make sure that our laws are just and that they are enforced equally for everybody. I mean, it's a very, very fair point that some people come into this world disadvantaged over others, and that can be because of the fact that laws were not equal. And and I think that's one discussion to be had. But at the same time, I mean, talking about police enforcement, B'nai B'rith put out in 2017 an 8-point plan to tackle anti-Semitism and hate crimes in Canada. We felt the need. This plan was actually endorsed by the Toronto Star, which doesn't always agree with all of the work that B'nai B'rith does, but it was endorsed because we noted, even in advance of what took place this past summer, that there was a need and a perception that the law isn't always equally enforced. And sometimes some groups view that as perhaps there's politics that's coming into play into this situation. We spoke about the need to have dedicated hate crimes units that have proper training, enhanced hate crime training, because we have wonderful police officers. They're already receiving great training, but if they don't have a personal experience into a certain community, they don't understand how that community works, and they don't get that enhanced training on how to deal with that community, well, mistakes are going to be made. Maybe charges are laid the wrong way or in an inconsistent way. Maybe charges are not laid because police feel that this is going to be causing problems between communities. At the end of the day, when I spoke about the Jewish-Black Alliance, it's because we at B'nai B'rith believe so strongly that creating these alliances within various sectors of Canadian society, getting different groups together in civil society, that's a big part of the solution here to move positively forward. We have to get groups at the civil society level working together, and then hopefully trust that our government and the laws that are enacted and the officials that are supposed to be enforcing those laws do so with complete equality under the law for everybody. And then I think by combining those two forces, hopefully we can get to a better society.
Gentlemen, question from Lila. I'll just use her first name. She asked, particularly in light of all the statistics, Wes, that you've presented, the history, Michael, that you've presented, Lila asks, how can we even use the word or the idea that our lawmakers could be neutral or making laws that make equality when the very laws are designed by many of the same people who sought to enforce the restrictions and the prejudices that brought them to office in the first place? And she goes on to say that clearly the statistics, Wes, that you showed demonstrate that these structures, these biases are so systemic or institutionalized and biased against women and Blacks and Indigenous Canadians, that can we really hope to use, as she puts it, the assumption of neutrality by our lawmakers with any degree of good faith and confidence?
Well, the information that I put forward, these were actually government statistics, and you should see the number of government reports that indicate that the way that Blacks and Indigenous people are treated in this country are very, very bad. Like they've indicated that, right? And these are government reports that were presented. The reason why we're using our business, the business people through the Black North Initiative, is so that wherever business goes, government follows and law follows. If the business people stand up and say this is unacceptable and it must change, it will change. I do agree. I showed a chart of the decision makers in this country. They all look the same. They're all just one race represented at the very top. But yet these are the people who are putting laws in place supposedly to protect me. And as I indicated, that there are some of those rules that they put in place, they're actually against me. Even though they say that it's supposed to protect me, it's against me. One of those is that, well, you're not allowed to collect put race-based information out there, because when you hire an employee, you can't ask them what race that they are. Well, that discriminates against me, because at the end of the day, nobody can know whether or not I'm a part of the system or not a part of the system, because I'm not allowed to say. Whereas if you look at the UK and the US, they actually provide that information and collect that information so that they can actually address the issue. So what we're saying is—
went through that fight in Montreal with the police, where we were actually asking for that and they were fighting us on it.
They said no. And, so what we're saying is that, no, you cannot be at the table that excludes folks of a certain race or nationalities and they're not at the table when laws are being made to supposedly protect them, right? They have to be a part of the conversation. So this whole fight that we're all having right now is that we must be a part of the conversation. I admire the Jewish community, and by the way, as Michael pointed out, quite clearly, our biggest allies are the Jewish community. That's the biggest ally that we have as a Black community. The Black Notice Initiative, the biggest donation that we have was from the Schulich Foundation for $1 million, right? And it's just, there's no question that that's where it is, because of the fact that the Jewish community understands what we're going through, because they've been there, right? And they're able to kind of help us in terms of the struggle to deal with a lot of the issues that we're dealing with today. So when we look at some of the laws, for example, the Jewish community was very strong in pushing for these changes that we see in the law. And we're hoping that we can use that alliance, teaming up with the indigenous people, teaming up with the Jewish community to really overall, overhaul the structure that we have today to make it better. And we will make it happen, but we have to do it collectively for us to make it happen.
Michael, let me ask you for your comments on another angle on this same question, and throw in, since Wes just mentioned Indigenous Canadians, a question from an anonymous, and Tadi wants to stay anonymous. First, can we really afford to consider or assume good faith or bon foi among our lawmakers and among our establishment leaders? And secondly, what can the problems of Indigenous Canadians, who have such a sad history, but yet an interlocking relationship with the government, can they be addressed in the same way as anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism, where the other communities, our communities, Blacks, Jews, are outsiders to the government system, whereas Indigenous Canadians find themselves both racially put upon, discriminated against, and yet are in this internecine relationship with government in terms of money and funding their communities. So first, on the good faith question, I know you're an optimist and I'm not, but that's okay.
Yeah, listen, I am an optimist, and I do, I always err on the side of trusting that people are of good faith. And I think that there's always bad apples. There's going to be a bad apple in, any school, any workplace, and any government and any police force. That always happens. But I think the vast majority of people that are up there are trying to do the right thing, are trying to be there, and usually are there for the right reasons. However, to Wes's point, if you're missing views, if there's no Black people around the table, if there's no women around the table, are they going to be missing a certain perspective when they're pushing forward and maybe sometimes bringing in their own biases, which they may not be conscious of when they're pushing forward in a particular direction. And we see historical shifts when all of a sudden segments of society rise up and say, hey, you know what? This is not fair. We need to see this change. And sometimes governments don't want to make those changes, but those changes have to come when enough of us in the population stand together and demand that change. And that's one of the wonderful things about Canada and Western society, that it is a democracy. We have the right to vote, and we have the ability to change. People are there for temporary periods of times. Thank God we don't have dictators right now, which are, we can't kick out and tell us what to do. So we need to ensure, fair reporting and journalism is very important, but also, this freedom under society. But it is important, by the way, though, to trust that there is good faith, because if we don't trust that there's good faith, then, we're talking about chaos. And if we're talking about chaos, that's not good for anybody. And I can say, Beryl knows this too from historical experience, particularly within the Jewish community, very, very bad things happen to a lot of people. So we want stability. We want to have, like as Wes mentioned, and I think the concept is sound and makes a lot of sense. Get business going forward, driving government, because they will follow in the right direction. And in terms of Indigenous, though, just very briefly, it is different. It is unique because of the history of the situation, because of the laws and the Indiana Act and everything. There's no question that there's a different way to go about it. But yet, we still have to have hope that there is a pathway forward. But sometimes we also have to recognize when something's not working, and we have to think about doing something in a different way to improve the situation.
The problem is that we can't change what we don't acknowledge, right? We hear politicians time and time again say that there is no systemic discrimination in Canada. We saw that in the video that we opened with. And we can't say that. The fact of the matter is that we cannot sit here and say people aren't treated differently. In particular, Blacks and Indigenous people aren't treated differently. I can't hide the fact that I'm a Black man. I can't walk into a room and disguise the fact that I'm Black. Everybody sees me and knows me. So if all of a sudden discrimination is right there, and the same with the Indigenous people as well. So, we look, for example, Canada, and I, just one correction, Michael, regarding slavery, history is not taught. Black history and Indigenous history aren't taught in schools in this country. And that's one of the problems that we have, right? Slavery was abolished in 1834 in this country, right? So we had slaves in the house that I lived in Rosedale. The patriarch of this family had 7 slaves, right? And we saw ads in the newspaper in Halifax that says, we're looking for a Negro and we're selling a Negro. And the reason why the Underground Railroad came to Canada is because of the fact that slavery was abolished earlier than in the US, 1834 here and 1865 in the US. And there's this time period whereby we're taking people in because people were fleeing because we didn't have it here. But we don't acknowledge those things, right? We don't acknowledge those things. The beauty about the Jewish community is that there is great cultural facility that Jewish community have that talks about the slavery and remind people of what the Jewish community went through historically. And those places are all over the world, not only just to educate Jewish people, but to educate other people as to what happened and why it will never and should never happen again. We unfortunately don't have those places, as in the Black community, also in the Indigenous community. And the hope is, with allies, that we can create those places whereby we can learn about our culture and the contribution that we've made to this great country, as opposed to just the bad things that have happened to us and that we're looking for handouts, right? We look at some of the amazing things that Black people and Indigenous people have done to Canada, but it's not highlighted anywhere, right? It's not in textbooks, it's not taught in schools, it's nowhere. So all of a sudden, it looks like we're a bunch of freeloaders, because the prison population, there's a lot of us in there. There's a lot of us in bad neighborhoods. Every time there's something wrong, our pictures are there. And but they don't talk about the good things that we've done. And that's why, as a community, we need to change that, and we will change that, but we need allies to make that happen.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you for, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, just with a Montreal connection, because I agree, and I think that's fantastic, Wes, and that just to your point, Montreal now has a hate crimes unit in its police force, but for the longest time, they didn't. And it was actually B'nai B'rith that was instrumental in getting them to do it. And for the longest time, they said, there's no hate crimes in Montreal. How do we know? Because there's no police force investigating it. Nothing's coming to our attention. So therefore, it doesn't exist. So just to your point.
Just to finish on a common point, and yes, Michael's right, and they did great work, and we've got a hate crimes unit, but it is more honored in the breach than in the reality. And on your note, Wes, about names, and it is easier for Jews today. We are white. People can't sometimes tell us, but I'll tell you about the name thing. So we're still going through, and I'm involved in all these cases. First of all, try growing up with a name like Weissman, spelled the way I spelled it. That's number one. But we have a rash of cases, even though we have laws against it, where police officers are stopping Black men in parking lots. 6 cases, I mean, every couple of months. Mais, vos papiers, s'il vous plaît, your papers, please. Mais Joel Denis Robitaille, c'est pas un nom francophone. This was, in this, the Robitaille case, this man was stopped 3 times because he was driving a very expensive car. He was rather young, properly dressed, but the police officers saw his identification and felt it was too Quebecois. It was too much of Quebecer. And what are you doing in this big car? And, you know, with the human rights leagues here, I fought the police, like it's every 2 months. It's like getting an invitation for dinner. Gentlemen, you're terrific. Your work is great. Wes, I have to get you together with Alain Babineau of CRAR in Montreal.
Happy to.
And a banker at BMO named Ken Mangachi. And I want to end with a paraphrase of a comment of Dr. Martin Luther King's in his I Have a Dream speech that goes too unnoticed. And he said, America has been writing checks on its Bank of Moral Credit to its Black citizens, and they always come back NSF. Sadly, the world always seems to be writing checks on its Bank of Moral Credit to beautiful words, and it always comes back NSF. Thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Beryl, Michael, thank you guys so much.
Thank you both.
Appreciate sharing the stage with you.
Absolutely. Thank you.